My name is David Larkin, and I'm losing myself. I don't know how much time I have left before the part of me that can still think clearly, that can still string together coherent thoughts and remember who I used to be, gets overridden completely by whatever is growing inside my chest. I'm recording this because I need to leave something behind while I still can, while I'm still me enough to explain what happened without the interference of the thing that's rewriting my brain, cell by cell. There's a circular scar on my left wrist, about 6 millimeters across, edges cauterized like a burn. And if you ask any doctor what caused it, they'd tell you they don't know. They'd run tests, take images, and eventually suggest it's some kind of industrial accident or maybe a medical procedure I don't remember. But they'd be lying, or ignorant, or both, because what made that mark isn't from here. I know that now with the same certainty I know my own name, though that certainty cost me everything I used to be sure of. I was a ferry pilot, which means I flew expensive aircraft from one place to another for people who'd just bought them, usually alone or with a co-pilot, crossing oceans and continents in machines worth more than most houses. It was solitary work, technical work, the kind of flying that required precision and absolute focus and gave you hours of silence at 40,000 feet to think or not think as you preferred. I liked it because I'm not good with people, never have been, and because I trusted machines more than I trusted almost anything else in the world. I was 42 years old, divorced for 6 years, no kids, no pets, no complications, and I believed in exactly 3 things: aerodynamic principles, instrument readings, and my own capacity to remain calm in emergencies. I didn't believe in UFOs or aliens or anything I couldn't measure with equipment designed by engineers who showed their work. I was wrong about that, and the wrongness is eating me from the inside out. The activations started 5 weeks ago, and they're getting stronger. That's what I call them, activations, because I don't have a better word for the sensation of something inside you switching on without your permission, making your body move or your mind fill with images that aren't memories, or your hands reach for flight booking websites at 3 in the morning. Last night I woke up in my car 40 kilometers from my apartment with no memory of driving there, and when I checked the GPS history, it showed I'd been circling the same coordinates for 2 hours. Those coordinates point to a place in the Amazon rainforest where no roads go, where nothing exists except trees and darkness and something that changed me on February 14th of this year. I wasn't abducted. I was transformed. And I don't know into what. It happened on February 14th, 2024, at exactly 2:47 a.m., 38,000 feet above the Amazon rainforest. I remember the time because I was checking the fuel calculations on the primary flight display when Marcus Brennan, my co-pilot, first saw the light. We were flying a brand new Embraer Phenom 300 from São José dos Campos in Brazil to Miami, which should have been as routine as any ferry flight gets. 6.5 hours of mostly empty sky over the Caribbean with nothing to do but monitor systems and watch the stars. Marcus was 29, fresh-faced in that way pilots in their 20s still are, enthusiastic about technology and always carrying cameras and recording devices like he expected every flight to reveal something worth documenting. I'd flown with him twice before, and he was competent enough, maybe a little too eager to chat during cruise when I preferred silence, but he knew his procedures and didn't argue with commands, and that was all I required from a co-pilot. The Amazon at night is darker than most people imagine, a blackness so complete it feels almost physical, stretching below you like an ocean of ink, with occasional pinpricks of light from remote villages or illegal mining operations scattered across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. We were following Airway UZ6, a standard route that cuts northeast over the densest part of the forest, and there was nothing below us but that absolute darkness, nothing above but the cold precision of stars, nothing around but the quiet hum of turbines and the soft glow of cockpit instruments. I was comfortable in that emptiness, had always been comfortable with it, and I was running through the descent planning for our approach into Miami when Marcus shifted in his seat and pointed toward the left side of the aircraft. He said there was something on the horizon, a light that didn't look right, and I assumed, without really looking, that he was seeing the glow from Manaus or maybe an electrical storm building over the Andes, but he insisted it was closer than that and brighter than that, and not moving the way any normal light should move. I looked then, really looked, and that's when everything I believed about the world started to come apart. There was a light out there, maybe 50 kilometers away, a pale amber glow that sat low on the horizon, exactly where there shouldn't be anything but forest and darkness. At first I thought it was a communications tower, maybe an illegal mining operation with floodlights, and I was about to dismiss it and return to my flight planning when I realized the scale was wrong. Towers don't look like that from this distance. Floodlights don't create that kind of illumination. And whatever was generating that light wasn't just bright, it was massive. And as we continued northeast at 450 knots, it grew larger in the windscreen until I could see it wasn't a single point of light at all, but something complex and structured and completely impossible. At first, I thought it was a communications tower, maybe an illegal mining operation with floodlights, but the closer we got, the more wrong that explanation became. The light wasn't coming from the ground, it was coming from above it, from something hovering in the air about 500 feet over the forest canopy, and it wasn't a single light, but dozens of them, arranged in geometric patterns across a structure that looked like nothing I'd ever seen or studied or heard described in any briefing about atmospheric phenomena. It was massive, easily the size of a football stadium, angular and complex, with surfaces that caught and reflected light in ways that didn't follow normal rules, as if the light was bending around edges that shouldn't exist, or passing through materials that were simultaneously solid and transparent. The structure wasn't a disc, wasn't a classic flying saucer shape from movies or tabloids. It was something more architectural, more deliberately designed, with sharp angles and interlocking sections that looked almost crystalline, and it was absolutely, perfectly motionless in the air. From the bottom of the structure, cylindrical beams of white light descended straight down, punching through the forest canopy like searchlights, and in those beams I could see individual trees illuminated as if it were noon instead of 3 in the morning. The beams didn't scatter or diffuse the way normal light does through atmosphere and particulate matter. They remained perfectly defined columns, and where they touched the ground below, I could make out cleared areas and what looked unmistakably like structures, small buildings or huts arranged in patterns that suggested human habitation. An indigenous village, I realized, completely isolated, probably uncontacted by the outside world, sitting directly beneath this thing and fully exposed in that impossible light. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, even as my hands stayed locked on the control yoke and my training fought against the urge to just stare. Helicopters, I thought, military helicopters running some kind of operation, but helicopters make noise, and I could hear nothing but our own engines. Experimental drones, maybe government drones, but nothing that size could hover that still, and the power requirements for lights that bright would be enormous. Marcus had his camera out, one of those expensive digital units he carried everywhere, and he was trying to get a shot through the windscreen, adjusting settings and muttering about the exposure, and I should have stopped him, but I didn't because part of me wanted evidence too, wanted something to prove I wasn't hallucinating or experiencing some kind of hypoxic episode at altitude. He raised the camera, centered the viewfinder on the structure, and pressed the shutter button. The camera died instantly, screen going black, battery indicator dropping from 96% to 0 in the space between one heartbeat and the next. And in that exact same moment, every instrument in the cockpit flickered. Display is going dark for a fraction of a second before returning to normal, except they weren't quite normal because now there was a sound. Not a sound in the traditional sense, not something you heard with your ears, but a deep vibration that I felt in my chest, a subsonic pulse that resonated in my ribs and made my teeth ache. The structure disappeared. Not gradually, not fading or ascending or moving away, it just ceased to exist. One moment dominating our field of view, and the next leaving nothing but the familiar darkness of the Amazon night, as if it had never been there at all. I don't know if it really vanished, or if they simply erased our ability to perceive it, if they flipped some switch that made our eyes and our instruments unable to register what was clearly still there, but the effect was absolute and instantaneous. Marcus and I sat in silence for maybe 3 seconds, both of us staring at the empty space where something impossible had just been, and then the autopilot engaged itself without any input from either of us. I reached for the disconnect button on the control yoke, pressed it firmly, felt the autopilot disengage with its usual tactile click, and then watched it engage again 2 seconds later. Marcus tried next, same result, and we looked at each other with the first real spike of fear, because aircraft systems don't do that. They don't override pilot commands. They don't have any mechanism to operate independently once you physically disconnect them. I pulled back on the yoke, testing the manual controls, and it felt wrong immediately, heavy and resistant, like pushing against something that was pushing back. And when I applied full backward pressure, the nose of the aircraft didn't move even a fraction of a degree. The throttles moved on their own, pulling back to reduce power, and the landing gear warning light illuminated because the gear was extending without any command from us. We were at 38,000 feet with the gear coming down, something that would create massive drag and force a descent. And I fought the controls while Marcus worked the radio, calling Miami Center, calling anyone, trying to declare an emergency, but getting nothing except static that grew louder and more aggressive until it cut off completely and left us in perfect silence. Not the usual quiet of a cockpit, but actual silence, the kind where even the background hum of systems disappears and you can hear your own pulse. The aircraft began a smooth, controlled turn, banking maybe 15 degrees to the left, coming around in what I recognized immediately as the start of a 180-degree reversal, taking us back toward where the structure had been. And no matter what I did with the controls, nothing changed. It was like the airplane had become a passenger, carrying us instructions from something else, and we were just cargo. The autopilot engaged itself, and every time I disconnected it manually, the system would wait exactly 3 seconds before engaging again, cycling through that pattern until I stopped trying, because nothing I did made any difference. Marcus was pulling circuit breakers now, going down the list of electrical systems that controlled the autopilot functions. It was overriding them at a level that shouldn't be possible with modern fly-by-wire architecture. I pushed the control yoke forward with everything I had, both hands locked on it, arms rigid, using my full body weight, and the nose remained exactly where it was, perfectly level, perfectly stable, as if I were pushing against a wall instead of a control surface designed to respond to minimal pressure. The throttles had pulled themselves back to near idle. The landing gear was fully extended now, creating that distinctive rumble of wind resistance, and we were descending at 300 feet per minute in a controlled glide that would bring us down to the canopy level in maybe 10 minutes. Marcus was shouting into the radio, cycling through every frequency he could think of, emergency channels and company frequencies, and even random approach controls, but all of it came back with the same dead air, and then even that disappeared, and the radio panels went completely dark. He hit them with the palm of his hand, a useless gesture born of frustration, and I told him to stop, because there was nothing we could do that would matter. Told him to just sit down and stay strapped in and prepare for whatever was coming, because fighting it was only wasting energy we might need later. I could hear the fear in my own voice, that tight, controlled quality that pilots learn to suppress, but never quite eliminate when things go genuinely wrong, and Marcus heard it too, because he stopped hitting things and sat back in his seat and gripped the armrests hard enough that I could see his knuckles turning white. The aircraft continued its turn, smooth and perfect, banking with the precision of an autopilot working from ideal parameters. And through the windscreen I could see stars rotating past until we were pointed back southwest, back toward the coordinates where we'd first seen the light. The vibration was back, that subsonic pulse I could feel in my chest, but not hear with my ears, and it was stronger now, more insistent, making it hard to take full breaths because every inhalation felt like it was meeting resistance. The descent continued, steady and controlled, and I watched the altimeter unwind through 35,000 feet, through 30,000, the numbers spinning down with mechanical inevitability, while I sat in a pilot's seat with my hands on controls that had become nothing but decorative objects. Below us I could see nothing but darkness, the absolute black of the Amazon with no reference points, no lights, no landmarks, just void. And somewhere in that void was the thing that had taken control of our aircraft and was now bringing us down toward it. My hands were shaking. I noticed that with a strange detachment, watching my own fingers trembling against the yoke, and I forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose and think about procedures, even though I knew there were no procedures for this. At 25,000 feet, I saw it again, or it allowed us to see it again, the structure directly below and slightly ahead, exactly where our flight path was taking us, no longer hovering over the forest, but rising to meet us, or maybe it had always been there and was just now switching our perception back on. The beams of light were gone now, no illumination of the village below, just the structure itself glowing with that same amber luminescence, and I could see details I hadn't noticed before, sections that seemed to rotate independently of other sections, surfaces that reflected starlight at angles that made my eyes hurt when I tried to focus on them. We were at 20,000 feet when the light started, not the beams from before, but something different, something that began as a faint brightening of the air around us and grew rapidly into an overwhelming white brilliance that filled the entire cockpit. It came through the windows, through the instrument panels, through the walls themselves, it seemed, erasing shadows and depth perception until there was nothing but white, and the sensation of pressure, massive pressure on my chest like someone was sitting on me, forcing me back into my seat with such strength that I couldn't move forward even if I tried. I could hear Marcus screaming something, but the words were lost in the pressure and the light, and I wanted to answer him, wanted to say something reassuring or useful, but I couldn't make my throat work, couldn't force air past whatever was constricting my chest, and the last thing I remember before the darkness was wondering in a strangely calm way whether this was what dying felt like. Then the pressure became absolute, the light became something beyond white, and I fell into nothing. I woke up thinking we were falling. The sensation was immediate and visceral, that stomach-dropping certainty that the aircraft was in an uncontrolled descent, and I jerked forward against my harness before my eyes were even fully open, hands reaching for the controls in pure trained reflex. For maybe 3 seconds I didn't recognize where I was, didn't understand that I was in a cockpit or what that meant, and then reality assembled itself in fragments. Instrument panels, throttles, the subtle vibration of turbine engines at cruise power. I looked at the displays with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, scanning for any sign of the emergency I was certain had to be happening, and everything read normal. Altitude 41,000 feet, airspeed Mach 0.70, heading 330 degrees magnetic, all systems showing green, all parameters exactly where they should be for routine cruise flight. The autopilot was engaged, properly this time, flying the programmed route with the smooth precision of a functioning system instead of the hijacked nightmare I last remembered, and outside the windows I could see stars and the faint suggestion of dawn beginning to gray the eastern horizon. Marcus was waking up next to me, going through the same confusion I'd just experienced, that moment of not knowing followed by the snap back to awareness and the immediate scan of instruments to confirm we weren't dead or dying. His hands were trembling badly enough that I could see it even in the dim cockpit lighting, and when he looked at me his eyes had that wide, shocked quality of someone who's just survived something they didn't expect to survive. I checked the chronometer on the instrument panel, a habit so ingrained I did it without thinking, and felt the first cold spike of real terror when I saw it read 0552. Our last clear memory had been at 0247, which meant we'd lost 3 hours and 5 minutes, a gap in our experience that should have been impossible, but was there in the timestamp like an accusation. I pulled up the GPS navigation display, thinking maybe the clock was wrong, maybe we'd crossed time zones in some way I wasn't accounting for, and what I saw made my hands go numb. The coordinates showed we were approximately 40 minutes of flying time ahead of where we'd been when the structure appeared, not 3 hours ahead, not anywhere close to what the elapsed time suggested. We'd been gone for 3 hours, but it only moved 40 minutes worth of distance, which meant we'd been somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't on any chart, somewhere outside normal space for most of that time. Marcus noticed his wrist first. He was rubbing it absently, still staring at the instrument, and then his expression changed and he pulled back his left sleeve with a sharp intake of breath. The mark was impossible to miss, a perfectly circular indentation in his skin about 6 millimeters across, edges raised slightly like a burn scar but cleaner than any burn I'd ever seen. Too precise to be accidental or natural. The center of the circle was pale, almost white, and the edges had a darkened quality like cauterization, and as I watched Marcus probe it carefully with his fingers, I felt a matching sensation on my own left wrist, a strange tightness I hadn't noticed until that moment. I pulled my sleeve back, already knowing what I'd find, and there it was, identical in size and position and appearance, a mark that looked medical and deliberate and completely unexplainable. Marcus was pressing around the edges of his mark now, and he froze suddenly with his fingers on his forearm about 2 inches above the scar, and I saw his face go pale. He pressed again, harder, and I could see from his expression that he felt something wrong, something that didn't belong, and when I touched my own forearm in the corresponding location, I felt it too. It was small, maybe the size of a grain of rice, hard and smooth and definitely not organic, sitting just beneath the skin and slightly mobile when I pressed on it. I could move it perhaps 2 or 3 millimeters in either direction before it encountered what felt like tissue resistance, and the sensation of touching it made my skin crawl in a way I'd never experienced before, a revulsion that was cellular and immediate. Marcus had found a pen and was marking the position on his arm, and when he measured the distance from his wrist, he went even paler and said it was moving. I thought he meant he'd moved it by pressing on it, but he said no, he meant it was migrating on its own, working its way up his forearm at a measurable rate, and when I checked my own I realized he was right. The object in my arm was approximately half an inch higher than the insertion point, which meant in the time between when these things had been put in us and when we woke up, they'd traveled that distance through our tissue. We marked the positions with pen and checked them every 15 minutes for the next hour, and the progression was consistent and undeniable, approximately 1 centimeter per hour, moving steadily up our forearms. I accessed the cockpit maintenance system and pulled up the flight data recorder interface, something I wasn't technically supposed to do during flight, but I needed to know what had been recorded during those missing 3 hours. The system showed 3 hours and 7 minutes of continuous recording from the moment the structure appeared until our awakening, which should have been reassuring, except when I tried to play back the audio file, I got nothing. Not static, not corruption, not the usual artifacts you'd expect from electromagnetic interference, just absolute silence, a complete absence of any recorded sound, as if the microphones had been disconnected, or as if there had literally been nothing to record. The flight parameters showed flat lines for most sensor readings during that period, not errors or no values, but actual data that suggested the aircraft had been in perfect steady flight, with no variations in altitude or speed or attitude, like it had been held absolutely stable in 3-dimensional space, while time passed around it. When I showed it to Marcus, he didn't say anything for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and he said, "We'd been borrowed." That's the word he used, borrowed, as if we'd been taken off some cosmic shelf and used for a purpose we couldn't understand, and then put back exactly where we were supposed to be. The rest of the flight to Miami took 4 hours and 32 minutes, and we spent almost all of that time watching the objects in our arms migrate steadily upward. By the time we landed, they traveled approximately 4.5 centimeters from the insertion point, roughly halfway to our elbows, small hard lumps we could track by touch as they worked their way through muscle and tissue. We didn't talk much because what was there to say that wouldn't sound insane, and we both knew, without discussing it, that we couldn't report this, couldn't tell anyone in authority what had happened because they'd ground us immediately and subject us to psychological evaluation, and we'd lose our licenses and our livelihoods and our identities as pilots. Better to stay quiet, we thought then, better to deal with it ourselves and see if maybe the objects would continue migrating and eventually pass through our system or dissolve or somehow resolve themselves without intervention. We were wrong about that, but we didn't know it yet. Over the following days, the migration continued at the same stay rate, and within 2 weeks the objects were no longer palpable in our arms, had moved deep enough into our torsos that we couldn't track them by touch anymore. The scars on our wrists remained, perfect circles of pale tissue that looked weeks old instead of hours old, and those scars are still there now as I record this, permanent reminders of the night we stopped being entirely human. We told ourselves we'd go to the authorities, that we'd report everything, that someone would have answers. That lasted maybe 3 days before we realized how naive we'd been. The first medical appointment was at an urgent care clinic, casual and anonymous, where I showed the scar to a doctor who looked maybe 30 years old and exhausted from a night shift. She examined it with the kind of distracted efficiency that suggested she'd seen worse, asked if I'd burned myself on an exhaust pipe or industrial equipment, and when I said I didn't know how it happened, she made a note about possible memory issues and suggested I follow up with a neurologist if I had other symptoms. The X-ray showed nothing unusual, which I'd expected since the object had already migrated beyond where simple radiography could distinguish it from tissue, and she prescribed antibiotic ointment and sent me home with instructions to keep the area clean. Marcus had a similar experience at a different clinic, same questions and same dismissal, and we met the next day to compare notes and decide what to try next. The MRI was more revealing but also more disturbing. We went to separate facilities, didn't want to draw attention by arriving together with matching symptoms, and both of us were told the same thing. There was an anomaly visible in the chest cavity, near the heart, approximately 1 centimeter in size, with imaging properties that didn't match any known tissue type or foreign material. The radiologist who read my scan was professionally curious about it, said in 20 years of practice he'd never seen quite that presentation, and suggested additional imaging and possibly a biopsy if it showed signs of growth or caused symptoms. Marcus told me later that he got a similar report, and when he mentioned to his radiologist that a coworker had just been diagnosed with something similar, the doctor became even more interested, started talking about environmental exposure or contaminated food supply, said he wanted to consult with colleagues and maybe write this up for a medical journal. 3 days later, Marcus got a call from the same radiologist, but Marcus said the voice on the phone was different somehow, flatter and more tense, and the doctor said he'd reviewed the images again and determined it was just an artifact from the scanner, nothing to worry about, completely normal variation that he had initially misread. When Marcus asked what had changed in his interpretation, the doctor was silent for several seconds and then said he'd simply made an error the first time, and when Marcus pushed further, the line went dead. That was when we started to understand we weren't just dealing with a medical mystery, we were dealing with something that had infrastructure behind it, something that could reach into hospitals and change reports and silence doctors. The FAA investigation started the same week, routine at first, just a request for our flight data and a few standard questions about the ferry flight, completely normal procedure after any international crossing. Then the questions became more specific, more pointed, asking about our mental health history and whether we'd ever experienced hallucinations or sleep disturbances, whether we'd used any substances before or during the flight that might impair judgment. The investigators were polite but persistent, and I could tell from the way they phrased things that they'd already formed a conclusion and were just gathering evidence to support it. Our employer called us in separately, suggested we might want to take some time off for personal matters, phrased it delicately but made it clear our flying status was under review pending the outcome of the FAA inquiry. I started searching online during those first weeks, looking for anything similar, any reports of pilots seeing structures or losing time or developing unexplained marks. The internet is full of nonsense when you search for UFOs. Hundreds of sites dedicated to blurry photos and obvious hoaxes. But buried in that noise, I found fragments of something that felt real. A forum post from 6 months ago, a pilot with a commercial license describing lights over Siberia and a gap in his memory and a circular scar he couldn't explain, asking if anyone else had experienced something similar. The thread had 3 replies before it was deleted, but I'd saved screenshots, and in those screenshots was an email address. I sent a message, careful and vague, saying I might have information about similar experiences, and waited. 3 days later, the email bounced back as undeliverable, account closed, and when I tried to find any other reference to that username, I discovered all their posts had been scrubbed from every forum I could access. A pattern started to emerge as I dug deeper, careful to use VPN services and anonymous browsers. There were others, scattered across different countries and different time periods, pilots mostly, but not exclusively, people who'd seen things they couldn't explain, and then vanished from public record, or stopped posting, or ended up in psychiatric facilities. I found one name that wasn't scrubbed completely, a cargo pilot named Robert Vance, who'd been flying routes over the Sahara and had posted extensively about strange lights and equipment malfunctions before his account went silent 2 years ago. I found an old professional aviation database that still had his contact information, a phone number listed as current through last year, and I called it expecting nothing. The number was disconnected, recording saying the subscriber was no longer in service, and when I tried to search for him in public records, I found a death certificate dated 8 months after his last post, cause listed as single vehicle accident on a rural road in Arizona. There were 3 others I could partially trace, all with the similar patterns, all with the investigation ending in dead ends or literally dead pilots. And sitting in my apartment looking at those names, I realized we were part of something much larger than just our incident. Marcus was struggling differently than I was. He kept trying to maintain normalcy, picked up a few ferry flights despite our employer's suggestion we take time off, and he told me he thought maybe working would help him feel like himself again. The first few flights were fine, or fine enough, but then he called me from Phoenix one night, and his voice was shaking when he said something had happened during the descent into McCarran. He had lost about 15 minutes. He remembered being at flight level 350 starting the approach, and his next clear memory was at 8,000 feet with Las Vegas filling the windscreen, and the flight management system showed that 15 minutes had passed between those 2 moments without him having any recollection of them. The aircraft had flown itself, descended perfectly, followed every waypoint, and he was there in the seat going through the motions, but some part of him had been absent or overwritten or asleep while his hands worked the controls automatically. When he checked his recorded flight path afterward, he found a small deviation, maybe 2 degrees off course for about 3 minutes, pointing southeast, pointing toward South America, before correcting back to the programmed route. He was crying when he told me that, really crying, saying he couldn't trust himself anymore, couldn't know if he was actually in control or if something else was using him like a puppet during those gaps. And I didn't have anything reassuring to say, because I'd started having similar experiences. Waking up in places I didn't remember driving to, finding search histories on my computer for flights to Manaus that I had no memory of researching, standing in my kitchen at 4 in the morning with a powerful compulsion to call airlines and book a ticket south. The dreams started 5 weeks after Miami. At first they were vague, just fragments of aerial views and the sensation of movement, easy enough to dismiss as processing trauma or stress. But within days they became specific and consistent and impossible to ignore. I would find myself flying over dense forest, not in an aircraft, but somehow suspended in air, and below me I could see a clearing with structures arranged in a pattern, small buildings with thatched roofs and a central area that looked ceremonial or communal. The perspective was always the same, always that specific angle and altitude, and the light was bright daylight instead of the darkness we'd actually experienced, as if I were seeing the place during a different time or from a different moment entirely. When I mentioned this casually to Marcus during one of our increasingly frequent meetings, just testing to see if he'd think I was losing my mind, he went pale and described exactly the same dream, same clearing and same structures and same angle of view, and we realized whatever was happening to us was synchronized in ways that went beyond coincidence. We both started waking at 3:47 in the morning, exactly 1 hour after the time of the initial event, jerking awake with our hearts racing and that same dream fresh in our minds. It happened every night for a week before we compared notes and discovered the timing was identical down to the minute. And that's when I started keeping a detailed log of everything unusual, writing down times and sensations and anything that felt different from normal. The dreams evolved into waking visions around week 7, brief flashes that would overlay reality for a few seconds before disappearing. I'd be driving to the grocery store and suddenly see the structure superimposed over the road ahead, translucent and ghostly but unmistakably there. And then I'd blink and it would be gone, leaving just normal traffic and normal sky. Marcus called me one afternoon in a panic because he'd seen it too at exactly 2:15 p.m. while he was sitting in a coffee shop, and when I checked my log, I'd had a vision at 2:14 the same day. We were seeing the same things at the same times despite being in different cities, despite having no physical connection, and that was when we stopped pretending this might resolve itself naturally. The compulsions started around week 9. Subtle at first, but growing stronger. I'd be going about normal tasks and feel a pull, an almost physical sensation like something tugging at my chest, urging me toward a specific direction or location. At first I could ignore it, could redirect my attention and force myself to focus on something else, but it became more insistent over the following weeks, until ignoring it required active mental effort that left me exhausted. I started mapping the directions when I felt the pull, using a compass app on my phone, and every single bearing pointed southeast, toward the Atlantic, toward South America, toward the coordinates where this had started. Marcus was experiencing the same thing but handling it worse, or maybe handling it more honestly, because he stopped fighting it as early as week 10. He called me one night at the airport, said he'd driven there without really deciding to, had found himself at the ticket counter asking about flights to Manaus before he'd consciously realized what he was doing, and only managed to pull himself away because the next available flight wasn't until the following day. He was terrified, not of the compulsion itself, but of how natural it had felt, how right, like something he was supposed to be doing instead of something being forced on him. Week 11 was when I started losing time in a way that couldn't be explained by sleep or distraction. I'd be reading a book and look up to find 3 hours had passed in what felt like minutes, or I'd start cooking dinner and come back to awareness standing in my driveway with the stove still on and no memory of leaving the apartment. The gaps were never more than a few hours, and I never went anywhere particularly far, but the lack of control was terrifying in a way I couldn't adequately describe, even to Marcus, like I was becoming a passenger in my own body. Marcus had it worse. He took another ferry flight against both our better judgment, told himself he needed to prove he could still function normally, and midway through he had an episode. He came back to full awareness at 35,000 feet with the autopilot engaged and the flight plan showing a waypoint he didn't remember entering. A slight deviation that would have added maybe 20 minutes to the route and pointed once again southeast toward the Amazon. He corrected course immediately and completed the flight without incident, but he called me afterward shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone and said he was done flying, done pretending he had control, done fighting something that was clearly stronger than his willpower. By week 12, we'd developed a routine of daily check-ins, calling each other at specific times to confirm we were still ourselves, still conscious of who we were, still capable of resisting the compulsions, even if barely. Marcus told me he'd started dreaming in a language he didn't speak, hearing words that sounded complex and structured but completely foreign, and when he tried to write them down on paper, they looked almost like mathematical equations instead of conventional language. I'd started having the same experience but hadn't mentioned it because it seemed too impossible, and when we compared the symbols we'd written, they matched perfectly, identical down to the smallest marks. That realization broke something in Marcus, broke the last wall he'd been maintaining between himself and the full reality of what we'd become. And he stopped trying to analyze it or document it or treat it like a problem that could be solved. Week 13 was when the synchronization became absolute. We'd be doing completely separate things in separate locations and suddenly both experience the same sensation, the same image, the same overwhelming urge. Marcus called me at 2 a.m. and before he could say anything, I knew why he was calling, could feel the same pulling sensation he was feeling, the same certainty that we needed to go to a specific set of coordinates that we both knew somehow without having looked them up. The coordinates weren't for Manaus or any airport. They were for a point deep in the rainforest, accessible only by boat or helicopter, and we both knew with absolute certainty that they marked the location of that village, the place where the structure had been hovering, the place we'd been taken. I told Marcus we couldn't go, that giving in would mean losing whatever remained of ourselves, and he agreed, but his voice was hollow when he said it, like he was just saying words he thought he should say, rather than things he actually believed. 3 days later, he sent me a text message that just said, "I'm sorry," and when I called him back, his phone was disconnected. I drove to his apartment and found it empty, cleared out in a hurry with some belongings still scattered around, but all his essential items gone. And when I checked his credit card activity through a mutual account we'd set up for emergency contact, I saw he'd bought a ticket to Manaus, departing that same morning. I wanted to feel angry or betrayed, but I couldn't because I understood exactly why he'd gone, could feel the same pull he'd been feeling, the same inevitability. I was losing time more frequently now, finding myself in strange locations with increasing regularity, and I decided to record this testimony while I still could, during a stretch of hours where I felt fully present and fully myself. I'm recording this 3 days after my last activation, and I chose this moment carefully because the clarity might not last much longer. Marcus disappeared 6 days ago, and I know where he went even though he didn't tell me. Knew it the moment I felt him absent from the strange connection we've developed over these months. The pull toward the Amazon is constant now, not a periodic compulsion, but a steady background presence like hunger or thirst, something my body insists I need to address, even though my mind understands that giving in means surrendering whatever remains of my original self. I've stopped trying to maintain normal routines because the effort required to resist makes everything else impossible, and instead I've been documenting everything I can remember, writing down details and timelines and names, in the hope that someone might find this useful or at least understand what happened to us. What I know for certain is that the phenomenon is real, that the structure over the Amazon exists and operates with purpose and intelligence, that the implants we received are active technology transforming us in ways I can only partially perceive. The medical anomaly near my heart hasn't grown according to imaging, but I can feel it now, a subtle presence that resonates with certain thoughts or directions. When I think about the Amazon, I feel it activate, a faint warmth that intensifies when I plan routes or look at maps. The transformation isn't just physical, it's neurological and perceptual, changing how I process information and what seems important or true. I find myself understanding concepts I never studied, thinking in patterns I don't recognize, and all of it feels both foreign and natural at the same time. The institutional response convinced me this is not the first time, that there's infrastructure in place to identify and suppress cases like ours. The radiologists who changed to story, the investigators who focused immediately on mental health, the forum posts that disappeared, and the pilots who died in convenient accidents. All of it points to something organized and well-practiced. I don't know if it's government or corporate or something else entirely, but I know they're real and they're watching. That's why this recording will be distributed to multiple locations, uploaded to services with automatic sharing, sent to journalists and researchers who might care enough to investigate. If you're listening to this and you're a pilot, particularly a ferry pilot who flies long routes over remote areas, pay attention to your instruments in ways you might not have before. If you see lights that don't behave like any aircraft or natural phenomenon, if you experience time loss or control anomalies, or wake up with marks you can't explain, understand that you're not hallucinating and you're not alone. Document everything you can while you're still yourself. Leave records in multiple locations. Tell people you trust even if they think you're crazy, because once the transformation progresses far enough, you won't want to resist anymore. The compulsion feels right when it's happening. Feels like something you're choosing rather than something being forced on you. And that's the most terrifying aspect, that you'll cooperate in your own erasure because they'll make you want to cooperate. I don't know how much longer I have before I follow Marcus south, before the part of me writing these words gets overridden by whatever is growing in my chest. So I'm leaving this record while I still can, while I can still say with certainty that my name is David Larkin, that I was a pilot who believed only in what could be measured and proven, that I saw something impossible over the Amazon rainforest, and it changed me into something I don't fully understand. If you felt what I'm describing, that pulled toward coordinates you've never visited, that certainty about things you have no reason to know, that sense of something inside you that isn't entirely you, then you're already transforming, and this message is for you. Tell someone. Write it down. Record it. Leave a trail of who you were before you become what they need you to be. My name is David Larkin. I was a pilot. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and now I'm becoming something I was never supposed to be.